I want to take a moment and express my unwavering support for the nation of Israel. The civilized world watched in horror as Hamas terrorists carried out brutal, barbaric, unprovoked attacks against the people of Israel. I stand with our great ally as they fight to eliminate the dire threat to their survival posed by the Iranian-backed terrorists. While the full extent of Iran's involvement in the October 7th attack is not yet known, this much is clear. Iran was complicit in the attacks, having provided financial, material, and logistical support to Hamas for years. I'm proud that House Republicans have unified and unequivocally in support of Israel, and I thank the chairman for holding this important and timely hearing to examine the threat of Iran, which extends far beyond the Middle East. Over the last few days, we have seen 13 separate attacks by Iranian-backed proxies on U.S. service members. As a member of this committee and the House Armed Services Committee, I find it completely unacceptable that the administration has not responded forcefully. Ambassador Sales, what steps would you advise the president to take to deter this type of aggression?
Well, Congressman, I think actions speak louder than words. We've heard just yesterday from the Secretary of State the right message, which is that if Iran harms American service members, we reserve the right to respond forcefully to defend our people, to defend our interests. But it's not an if. It's already happened. Reportedly, more than 24 American service members have been injured in the course of this rocket and drone campaign by Iran-backed proxies over the past week. What are we waiting for? How many more have to be injured before we restore deterrence? Do we have to wait for people to die before we establish deterrence? The way to avoid an escalatory situation in the Middle East, the way to avoid being dragged into a war, which we all want to avoid, is to enforce red lines with actions, not simply rhetoric.
Thank you. As my friend from Mississippi highlighted earlier, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence 2023 Annual Threat Assessment states Iran will continue to threaten U.S. persons directly or by way of proxy attacks. Particularly in the Middle East, Iran also remained committed to developing surrogate networks inside the United States, an objective it has pursued for more than a decade. Mr. Greenway, can you explain to the committee how Iran develops terror networks within the United States?
Thanks for the question, Congressman. For decades, and as I mentioned in oral and written testimony, the first assassination attempt conducted by the Islamic Republic in 1980 was in the United States, just outside the Capitol. And they have since built an infrastructure built on their surrogates and proxies to conduct operational activity, espionage, foreign influence, and now cyber attacks. All of that is expanded, and all of that, it seems, has been deprioritized, again, in the change in administration policies, and I think we're exposed as a result of it.
Thank you. Mr. Greenway, when you were at the National Security Council, what steps did the previous administration take to dismantle Iranian-backed terrorist networks, and how does that differ from what we're seeing with the current administration?
Thank you, Congressman. First, we denied access to all resources available through exports, through foreign accessible exchange, and through trade balances, and that, in essence, deprived them the resources to constitute and sustain these networks. Second, we prioritized law enforcement in order to conduct operations in the United States that would aggressively pursue these threats and apply the full range of law enforcement options against them. Third, we employed a strong and robust relationship with partners and allies to do the same. We didn't incentivize the taking of hostages. We penalized the taking of hostages. And so we didn't require the exchange of resources to obtain them.
Did you happen to see the statement of the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres? And I quote what he said this morning: Hamas attacks had to be seen in the context of years of suffocating occupation. What are your thoughts on that?
I think if we had heard a similar sentiment after 9/11, we'd have been offended, and I think many here today were offended by his remarks. The only appropriate response to the terrorism we saw from Hamas is condemnation and an absolute offense.
Do you believe he ought to be removed from the United Nations?
I don't see why he should stay in his office after making those comments.
I totally agree. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.